Okay, ladies and gentlemen, when we last left, we had this, and this is an example of a state. It's got its territory, population, government, and of course, sovereignty. And then we kind of left off on these four ideas that actually make a government be able to run. That is power, authority, legitimacy, and sovereignty. So let's look at these things in a little more detail that makes a government able to exist. And of course, governments help prop up economic systems that deal with scarcity. Thank you for letting me be your teacher. Yes, that's me, pretty with the unicorn. Um, however, some questions. What actually gives me the ability to get people to behave? Even when people don't want to behave, what gives me the ability to do that? What gives me the right to even engage as a teacher? What makes you believe that I can actually teach you? And actually, how far does my teaching authority reach? Does it go beyond the classroom or what's going on here? All right. And so, what we're going to do is let's talk about these concepts in relationship to me and then relationship to a state. So, power is the ability to get people to behave in certain ways. All right. Basically, it's the ability to govern, to rule. All right. Now, for in terms of a school uses power to get you to behave. So we have things like referrals. We have things like grades that are used as incentives to get you to behave in a certain way. And of course, like the I guess you'd say the threat of graduation or not being able to graduate. All these things can get you to behave in a certain manner. Now, how does a democratic state use power? Do they use the military to wield power? And the answer is they don't. All right. The military is used to fight against enemies. So democratic states don't use the military to get people to behave within the country. That's bad because then the country would be considered the enemy. No. Governments use powers in different ways: enforcing law, using the police, fines, jail time, that would be considered a state use of power. Using money to fund certain programs. This would be an example of using power, getting people to behave by, um, whether it's giving them Medicare, safety nets, those kinds of things. The ability to vote. The vote is a form of power because you can change governments. And of course, different kinds of actions, Operation Warp Speed, or immigration reform, or different kinds of laws and actions, regulations that a government takes. That is an example of a state actually using power. Okay. Now, authority is simply the act of the right to rule. Something actually gives you the authority to rule a population, to govern. In a school, what gives the school authority? Well, you have California Ed Code that literally says what are the laws of the school can and can't do. You have, for me, I have a teaching credential. So there's some kind of government institution that says you are a teacher. And of course, I mean, how does anybody know that I actually know the subject that I taught? Well, I have a university degree. So, I mean, no one asked me, do you know economics? Do you know US history? Do you know world history? Do you know government? No, they just said, do you have a degree? And that apparently gives you the authority to teach certain subjects. Okay. What gives a state authority? Well, of course, a constitution, whether it's an actual country in terms of a national constitution or a sub-regional government like California. You have foundational documents that says this is what you can do. You have the right to rule, like literally because it says so in that document. If you follow these rules and standards, you have the right to actually govern. Now, in a place like the UK, of course, they don't have a constitution, but they have a tradition of democratic gradualism, democratic consolidation, that where people say, well, that gives you the right to rule because we've been doing it that way for so long. Okay. Legitimacy is probably the most important part of government. It's the people's belief that their government has the right to rule. If the people don't believe you have the right to rule, pretty much everything else doesn't matter. And then your state, your country is actually in danger of falling if you lose legitimacy. Okay. So, what gives a school legitimacy? Well, first, the fact that it's been around for so long. Like the Ukiah has had a school going back from like 100 years. They've had some kind of public education system. This is an old school building here in Ukiah. What else gives a school legitimacy? Well, the fact that you enjoy being here. So they give you events like homecoming, dances, extracurriculars, those kinds of things. If you're involved in that and you feel kind of like a happiness of being here, well, then look, you see the school as legitimate. That you have people that work as authority members that you trust or that you believe care for you or you believe that think that what they're doing is actually best for you. If you didn't agree on that, you would act out or you just wouldn't show up to their class. And finally, the fact that you feel safe, that there are rules and policies that stop your bad things from happening on campus. That gives you says like you can teach me because I think what you're doing is legitimate and good. Okay. What gives a state legitimacy? Well, kind of almost the same thing. The idea that the United States has been around for over 200 years and that it has been a democracy, an evolving better democracy over that time. What else? Well, moving forward, progressing as a country, that you're not just in a stagnant state, that you are technologically, idealistically, you are moving forward in a positive progression. This includes things like economic growth as well, that you have leaders that care for you. Um, Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan were probably two of the more popular presidents in the last 50 years. Why did well, what was their number one thing? Well, they actually did something very similar to most people. They made them feel proud to be an American, and if you felt proud to be an American, you saw the leaders of the country as legitimate. And then finally, of course, the idea that the Constitution is based on the people. Well, if I believe that I have a part in governance, that I am a part of the process of governing, I'm going to see the decisions that the people make as legitimate because they are part of the process. Okay, so that's what gives a state the legitimacy, where people believe that the government has the right to rule. Last one is sovereignty. Sovereignty is supreme and ultimate power or authority within a territory, and we want to always say supreme and ultimate power and authority within a territory. So, what gives a school sovereignty? Well, then you just ask yourself, does the school have complete and total control over its borders? And the answer is it doesn't. The school does not have sovereignty, period, because the school ultimately still must follow the school district's rules, the city laws of Ukiah, Mendocino County's laws, the state of California's laws, US federal laws, and ultimately the United States Constitution. Remember, you can't compel somebody when the Pledge of Allegiance is done every day. You cannot compel somebody to stand. That is a First Amendment issue. Ukiah High School must follow that constitutional law. Okay. So the school does not have sovereignty. Okay, well, then what gives a state sovereignty? Ultimately, what gives the state sovereignty is the United States military because it stops other countries from coming in and breaking that absolute power to control over your own borders. Okay, so the military is the number one thing. Obviously, diplomacy with other countries, the idea that the other countries recognize that sovereignty, that is the main thing. But ultimately, what gives a state sovereignty is the military stopping other countries from being able to come in and take power away. Now, can sovereignty be threatened from inside of a country? It absolutely can. When people start seeing the government as not legitimate, then the ability for that government to rule becomes threatened. And that's really, really, really dangerous. And we'll take a look at examples of that in later sections. So, what gives me the ability to get people to behave? That's power. What gives me the right to teach? That's my authority. What makes you believe that I can teach you? That's legitimacy. And how far does my teaching authority actually reach? That's sovereignty. Of course, remember, I don't have the power to reach beyond really the classroom or the campus. Then a state, what gives the government the ability to get people to behave? That's its power. What gives government the right to rule? That's authority. What makes you believe the government has the right to rule? That's legitimacy. And how far does the government's power extend? That's the idea of sovereignty. You put this all together, and what we have here is a state. Okay. And then we look at what type of government deals with sovereignty, legitimacy, authority, and power. Okay. And this is where you start getting political systems. Okay. If a political system reigns over a country over a length of time, that is known as a regime. Okay. Now, a political system is different than a government. A political system is a broad overall um, idea that dominates over everything within the state. And there are two primary political systems that we're going to be looking at, and you're really familiar with them. One is a democratic regime, where a lot of these authority, legitimacy, power, and sovereignty issues come from the population putting pressure on the government. It's where the people have a greater say in how the government works. So the pressure actually comes in a democratic regime from the population making sure the government is held accountable, maintaining that legitimacy, authority, power, and sovereignty. The opposite of that is an authoritarian regime. An authoritarian regime is a regime where one person or a group of people hold ultimate power over what happens. So instead of the people having that influence, an authoritarian, a single person or group of people, they rule over the authority, legitimacy, power, and sovereignty. And what we're going to be looking at over time is, how these different regimes, authoritarian and democratic regimes, use these four different parts of government to keep and hold their power and maintain stable democracies or stable authoritarian dictatorships in trying to deal with the concepts of scarcity.